Hey everyone, welcome back to our walking through kind of randomly, at least hop, skip, and jumping through Psalms. And after the first few Psalms that I did, I wanted to kind of transition into something a little different. Those first Psalms, in a lot of ways, talked about at least the last couple of them, troubles and things like that. And those are good and applicable. But I thought I'd take a different toned psalm, and of course I fell into one that maybe is the most familiar. I know it's the most familiar psalm that is out there. Psalm 23, the Shepherd's Psalm. It is familiar to us. A lot of hymns, a lot of things that we use in church services. It's read every funeral that I do. Very familiar, very comforting, wonderful picture that, in fact, Jesus will pick up on in the New Testament too, in talking about his relationship with people. So, figure we jump into Psalm 23 today and just review and relive that and look at that. Just some introductory thoughts before we do. What are the realities of being a sheep? I mean, after all, it's a shepherd's psalm. A shepherd is defined by tending to sheep, and in that, David appropriates for us the fact that we have a shepherd. It means that we are sheep. What does that mean? What about sheep can we say we are like them in this relationship? Which then leads us to think about another thing then. If the psalm is a relationship song about us as sheep and our Lord as the shepherd, what about us as sheep? Well, what about the Lord as a shepherd? What does a good shepherd do for his sheep in this relationship? And then finally, what's gained from it? There's benefit to the relationship between a sheep and a shepherd. And these are the things, as you read through the song, that I think you naturally want to consider and think about. The heading of the psalm, again, this one has one. It simply says it's a song of David. And that, there's some things to think about there. David, of course, we know was the king of Israel. Before that, he was a shepherd for his father Jesse. And so you can kind of track the song, I suppose, then in two different ways that are similar. God himself actually calls his kings and his priests and prophets as well shepherds of his people. So David, as a king, writes this song, and maybe he's got in mind his idea of his kingship and that relationship over his people, and applying that kingship to his God, but also maybe bringing, no doubt, bringing about his shepherd past in Jesse's household, and that relationship that he had with sheep, and applying that even to himself as a king and to the Lord as a shepherd and as a king. And so you have this thing going on. It's kind of interesting because we'll get to a point where you have kind of a consistent thought of what the verses mean, but at the end of it, you can go in two different directions depending on whether David has in mind the shepherd or has in mind the king. And we'll just real quick briefly talk about that when we get to it. Verse 1, which I think is really just the overarching theme of the entire song. The Lord is my shepherd, I lack nothing. Looking at the Lord, there's two really key words there. The one is the Lord, and that comes up in the Hebrew, and that is the proper name of God that he actually gave to his people. It's a form of the verb to be. It's the I am. Tell them I am has sent you. When Moses said, what should I say? Who sent me to free the people? Tell them I am has sent me. The idea of the Lord being consistent. He's always there. He never changes. When he says something, it is always true. It is the proper name of the covenant God with his people. And so anytime that David would have thought of the Lord, he would have thought of the promise that God had made to be at one with his people. The covenant God who is the shepherd, and David says is my shepherd, the one who I have a relationship to, and what does David say? As a sheep. And because of that, he doesn't lack anything. He doesn't, there's nothing he wants. Kind of a neat word there. I looked at some other usage of it, and that word for lacking actually is brought up by the prophet Nehemiah, or by Nehemiah in his book, and talking about the people in the wilderness, the Israelites in the wilderness, and through all those years, those 40 years in the wilderness, it says they lacked nothing. God led them, and what they lacked nothing. And so David, really just recognizes this as a theme for the song. With the Lord as my shepherd, as a sheep, there's nothing that I want. There's nothing that I lack. Now, the explanation for it. What does he have that he doesn't lack? Well, he makes me lie down in green pastures. He leads me beside quiet waters. And the picture there that I got anyway is that, he makes me lie down. The idea of the verb is that it's Jesus who is the cause. It's God, it's the Lord who is the cause of the lying down in green pastures. And I almost have this idea of him picking up and laying the sheep down in the green pastures. And of course, green pastures then are pastures that the sheep can go ahead and feed in and eat of, and not worry about certain things, that they're always abundant, that they're not dried out where the sheep are fighting with each other. They all have enough to eat. He leads me beside quiet waters. And there's two different kinds of waters that become dangerous to a sheep. And one would be a very fast-moving stream. During rainy season, you might have those things where if a sheep gets a little too deep or caught up, can get swept away, and although sheep can swim, they're not good at it, and especially if their fleece is long, it gets soaked down and becomes harder and harder to swim, and they certainly are known to drown in certain cases. So the quiet waters, but don't get the impression that it's just a 3-gallon pool in mud that becomes septic and are dangerous waters. This would have the idea really of maybe a pond that has a source, a water source that keeps the water clean for the sheep. So always good pastures, always good waters with the Lord as the shepherd of the sheep. And think of what is behind this. If I didn't have the Lord as my shepherd, I would be lacking. What would I be lacking? Well, I'd be lacking green pastures, and I'd be lacking clean waters. So the sheep is David is confessing that I'm helpless by myself to find these things or to have these things. He refreshes my soul. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. The idea of refreshes my soul, he restores my soul. And I read a commentary by a shepherd on this psalm that actually was, there was all kinds of ideas in this role that he had with the sheep that I think is neat. One of them, the restoration of the soul, and the idea of a shepherd. Sometimes sheep are weird creatures. Just the more I read about them, the more you realize this is such a great illustration of the Lord and his people. Sheep will find a green pasture, and that's great, and they'll stand in one spot, and they'll eat in one spot, and they'll get rutted down into one spot, and they'll find themselves a little tipsy. They'll eat a rut out of the earth and actually flip over, and they're a bit like turtles. They're so top heavy that they'll fall over, roll on their back, and their legs will be up in the air like this, and they can't get back up onto their feet. And so the shepherd will be looking over the pasture, looking for the 4 feet flipping around up in the air, and might even have an eye on the buzzards, because the buzzards might be starting to circle, which will clue the shepherd off to what's going on here, and see the feet flipping around, and he has to go over and turn the sheep back on its feet, and doesn't just turn it on its feet, but actually will have to, because the blood rushes through the legs and cramps up the legs, that once you flip them over, then you got to massage the legs back into a kind of a healthy relationship where the sheep can kind of handle themselves on their own. What a wonderful illustration of the Lord as our shepherd, that even in green pastures we can find ourselves in danger from buzzards, and danger from being on our back and unable to defend ourselves. I think a neat picture there. He guides me along the right paths for his name's sake. The old NIV, which I always find weird, the old NIV, but he guides me on paths of righteousness for his name's sake. And what a neat thing that is. Sheep don't stay to a path. I just read a story yesterday about a flock of sheep, I think in New Zealand, that was written about. 1,500 sheep flock, and one of them went over a cliff, and they all followed over a cliff. 450 or so of the sheep died, and the only reason that any of them survived is they started to land on top of the other ones and stopped dying, because I don't know, all the cotton and wool and stuff like that had stacked up to a point where they survived falling on top of each other. But that's the kind of creatures that sheep are, and one heads off the path, and they all follow off the path, and you need some guidance and some leadership as a sheep. They're blind as a bat, and they just need to be led, and God is the one who leads on good paths, righteous paths. And I think it's really neat too to think of the idea that for his name's sake, a shepherd who's got a sickly, wobbly flock that's eating in muddy fields and burrowing, looking for something, and drinking septic water and dying in the fields. The shepherd's going to have a horrible reputation, going to be a bit of a schmuck. But with the Lord as his shepherd, the sheep are healthy, and they're guided, and they're restored, and they're on the right paths, and they're beside quiet waters. They're healthy. And what does it say of the shepherd? So he does it all, for his name's sake. It leads me to think of Jesus' words on the Sermon on the Mount, encouraging his people to be salt but then light too. And he says, so let your light shine before men, that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven. That in a roundabout way, the good that is done in the flock becomes a glory to the one whose flock it is. So a nice picture here that David leaves. Then even though I walk through the darkest valley, this is actually a better translation of the Hebrew than the old. Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, that's a treasured translation. It certainly is an application for it. But the idea in the Hebrew is, though I walk through even the darkest of all valleys that are there, I fear no evil, for you're with me, your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The one way to take this as, the shepherd who is seasonally leading his sheep, and he might lead them from this field down low, but you can't let a flock destroy a field by feasting on it for too long. Eventually you got to lead them in the summer to higher fields. And to do that, you follow the creeks up through the foothills and through the mountains into the taller fields. And sometimes those creeks come down very skinny, narrow alleyways that are carved out, I suppose, by the water. And as you get in there, the sun is not able to shine in, and those valleys get very dark. Even though I go through these valleys in life where the sun seems not to be there, David says, I fear no evil. Why that is not because I can't see, or because I've got some supernatural ability to see in the dark, or that I'm immune to fear, but I don't fear because you're with me. My shepherd is with me, and your rod and your staff, they comfort me. A shepherd might have a very jumpy, fearful sheep, as leading the flock through, one of the things that he will do is use his shepherd staff to just keep that sheep close, and just every once in a while, tap him. And it's just his way of letting the sheep know, I'm here, I'm here, I'm here. And as long as he keeps doing that, the jumpy sheep are calm, and they don't let their fear overtake them. And certainly the Lord does that, doesn't he, with us in our life. His shepherding staff is his word. And even in dark times, they're here. I think of, you can always pull this coronavirus back in, but all that's going on, that's here. Think of the season that we're in. We're in the season of Easter, which is the season of hope, the season of life, the season of everything being pulled together. God forgives us. He loves us. We know it full well. We've got a life waiting for us in heaven. We've got hope because of it. Just a tapping us as sheep, with his shepherding staff, and leading us through even the dark valleys of life. And every stage has got its own. You prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. And this is where you can kind of, depending on if you want to take this as just a shepherd psalm all the way through, you can look at it in terms of the upper fields being the tables. Sometimes they're referred to the fields that are there that have to be prepared. You got to clear the snakes and clear this and clear that, and do these types of things for the sheep to be able to enjoy their time there, and doing it in the presence of the enemies, where you might have mountain lions and everything else that are watching you prepare this as a shepherd. And you do this all there for your sheep. You anoint my head with oil. In the summer, the bugs come out, and one of the techniques that shepherds use is to actually put oil on the heads of the sheep to keep the flies from going in the ears and the nose, because then you read stories of the worms, the larvae, that actually get up in the brain of the sheep, and they'll smash their heads against a rock, and because they're irritated so hard and so consistently that they've been known to kill themselves doing it. And so it's really important that a shepherd would actually take some preventative measure. And if that is what David has in mind here, that's a nice picture too, that the shepherd cares for us that way. The other way to look at it is more on the king side of it. In the Near East in those days, if you think of a king and what would be called a vassal, if you were the kings of Israel and Judah did this with Babylon and with Assyria. They would enter into agreements with them, and they would pay tribute to them, recognizing that ultimately Assyria is the authority, or ultimately Egypt or Babylon is the authority here. And one of the things that would seal that deal is that the king would prepare a table, the vassals would come, and you might have a royal meal at the king's table that was there, and you might not get along with the vassal next to you, but it's still prepared there with you. So you prepare a table before me in the presence of my enemies. You anoint my head with oil, my cup overflows. Oil, even for human beings, doesn't have to be for a king thing. That was a regular thing. If you honored somebody when they came to your house, you might, after a long travel, they're all filled with stink and dirt and everything else. Oil that might have some perfume in it, be poured over the head and run through the hair. Jesus, in fact, with the sinful woman who anointed her feet, kind of insinuated that the Pharisee's house he was standing, he said, you didn't anoint my head with oil, but she anointed my feet. So it was a common practice that was done there. My cup overflowing, just the idea of a cup with a king who pours it to the point where it's just more than enough. He's not being stingy with it. Two different ways to kind of look at that verse, and both of them are fantastic when you think of the Lord as our shepherd. We've got every provision, we've got everything we need. And because of it all, the wrap-up of the psalm, surely your goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. Again, if you're looking at it from the shepherd point of view in a seasonal thing, the shepherd commentary that I read looked at it in terms of starting at the house up into the summer fields, and then you come back. surely goodness and love will follow me all the days of my life. And coming back down out of the hills to the field where in the spring the sheep were eating and feasting and also fertilizing the field, that when you eat that field down and you go up to the summer fields and you come back, that fertilizer had kicked in and would come back. In fact, read stories of sheep that actually are the cure for desolate fields. If a rancher lets a field go to waste and it's run down and everything else, that you actually just throw a herd of sheep out there, that their manure is the best, and actually will bring almost dead fields back to life. And so surely goodness and love follow me all the days of my life, and I'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever. A neat way of thinking of it again too, not that we're so beneficial, except that what God does work in us does follow us. Our good deeds are spreading and speaking of the gospel in this world. What we leave in the path of our life is more than just an inheritance for our kids in terms of money, but in terms of the life that we live in gospel service. Goodness and love follow us. It's a truism, always again to the glory of the name of our shepherd, but that can certainly be looked at that way, or just a simple statement of fact that wraps up the confident boldness of the one who is a sheep and a shepherd of God. I dwell in the house of the Lord for the length of days that he gives me, not only here, but knowing that my days extend forever. That's where you get that translation, forever. And there you go. There's the shepherd psalm, real quick, like some of the applications. What are the realities of being sheep again? Helpless, hopeless, at danger from enemies, at danger from parasites, prone to taking bad paths that lead to our demise and our death. We're helpless things in many ways, and that's the reality of it. You make a spiritual application to that. I can't. What am I going to do? I mean, the devil's going to feast on me. This world will have me as its own and destroy me, and I will find myself on a path right over the cliff. And that's just going to happen without good leadership and good guidance. What does a good shepherd do for his sheep? And again, here the thing is good. What's a good shepherd? You get bad shepherds. Jesus will look at the hired hand, and there's a difference there. You pay somebody to take care of your sheep, or you take care of your own sheep. A good shepherd who is really looking out for the good of his sheep and the well-being of his sheep. What does he do? Well, in fact, I remember the first time I preached on this psalm, I broke it into three parts. What do we get, from the good shepherd? And it really does tie into this, what's gained from the relationship. Perfect provision in the fields and by the waters. Perfect protection as he restores our soul and as we walk through dark valleys. And then perfect peace, knowing that in our heart, in our head, in our life, and in all things in our eternity, we'll dwell in the house of the Lord forever and be glad that we got everything we need in this relationship. So a treasured look at a treasured psalm. I'm going to pick up on this on Friday when we look at another section, because I'm just going to follow this and we'll look at John 10, where Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. So we'll look at that and make this kind of our shepherd week, maybe, as much as anything. And other than that, I look forward to seeing you then and talking to you then about the good shepherd a little farther.